Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced, and if you've been enjoying all the videos on this channel about cool data topics, make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn. But today what we're going to do is we're going to set up our DBT profile. So in the previous video, we set up our Dremio and Python environment. So now that we have our Python environment and our Dremio environment all set and ready to go, we now just need to, well, set up a DBT profile and a DBT project, which we can then run against our Dremio cluster. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna clear this terminal here. And now that I have like a Python environment activated, so again, we see that here, and we've installed DBT with pip install DBT Dremio, as we did in the previous video. Now all I need to do is create a new DBT project. And what you do is you use the command dbt init, okay? And then you would put the name there, okay? So let me just document that in our README here, okay? And I'll add that documentation between videos. So dbt init, here we're going to write dbt init, we'll say Dremio project or Dremio tutorial. Okay, and again, whatever you name it, it's what you're also going to create a profile by the same name, which gets stored in a separate file, which I'll point out later on. Okay. So then you're going to get these prompts. The first thing is going to ask you which, so if you have multiple DBT plugins installed, you might have different options here. But in this case, the only DBT plugin I have installed is Dremio. So then I can click one. So that's the one I want to use. And specifically, I'm connecting the software. So if it's running on your computer, if it's self-managed, it's software. If you're using a cloud managed, so you signed up through Dremio.com and you log in through the cloud, that would be Dremio Cloud. Okay, and on the Dremio YouTube channel, I do have videos showing you how to use Dremio Cloud and Dremio software with DBT, how to set up the connection. Okay, now here I'm going to use software with username and password. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So in this case, we're going to put in our software host, which is just our local computer. So this is really just the IP address, okay, or common name of the server that has the master node running on. In this case, we're running in a single node environment right on our laptop. So it's just literally 127.0.0.1. Okay, and that's it. That's the address. It's going to ask the port, just accept the default. Then you have the username, which is just the username and password that when you first set up your Dremio environment in the previous video. Okay, now use SSL. Again, assume it's false because we're working from our local environment. Now, object storage source has to either be like an object storage source, literally like an S3 connection to Dremio, at Google Azure. So essentially, if I were to go back to Dremio for a moment, it could be any source that generally you can write an iceberg table to. That's really the criteria here. So that could be Nessie, which we have 2 Nessie catalogs set up if you've been following the directions in this video series. Could be AWS Glue, Hive, could be Amazon S3, Azure Data.Lake storage, I'm pretty sure probably Azure Storage as well, Google Cloud Storage, actually pretty much any of the ones here, basically just not the databases, okay? Because the databases are just databases, they're not used for writing, they're not object storage where we can write Parquet files to, so you can't write an iceberg table to them. Cool, so basically any of the meta stores, object storage, or Nessie catalogs would be fine. So in this case, what you do is you put the name of the source we want to use. In this case, we'll use warehouse. Okay, so I'm going to use warehouse. So I'm going to say, hey, warehouse will be the name of the object storage source. And the schema would be like, hey, a folder in that source that you would like to use. In this case, no particular path, but let's, for example, just to show you an example what that would be, let's say in warehouse, I created a folder called, output. So I click here and I create a new folder in the warehouse catalog called output. Okay, and then in that folder, I created another folder called test1. Then what I would do is over here for schema, so the object storage path, I would put output.test1. Okay, so essentially between the two, so object storage source, warehouse, and the object storage path, it's going to create the path to where we would use object storage to materialize things. So warehouse.output.test1. Okay, now Dremio space is referring to the spaces we have here. So in this case, DBT practice. Okay, and again, I'll do the same thing in here. I'll create a folder called output And then in their folder, I'll create a folder called test1. Okay. And then in here, what I can do is, again, I can specify the name of the space, which was DBT practice. And again, if this was Dremio Cloud, you'd be specifying one of the Arctic catalogs in your particular Dremio Sonar project. Again, pretty much the same idea. DBT practice. And then here I can then specify what path inside that source, inside that space, that I'd like stuff to output to. So output.test1 again. Okay. And then threads 1 is fine. Okay, cool. So our project is set up. And what this essentially does is, like, when filling out all the information, basically what it does is that there's a file that's located in ~.dbt. So if I'm going to list the files in that folder, and you see there's a file in there called profiles.yaml. So every time you do a DBT init, all those configuration settings create a profile in that YAML file that you can reference. Okay, so that's where all that data is. I'm not going to cat it because I have other profiles that have sensitive information in them. But if I were to open up, so you notice it created this new folder, Dremio tutorial. That is the DBT stuff. So I'm going to want to CD into that folder. So CD into Dremio tutorial, because that's going to be where we need to operate out of to use DBT. So if I open up this folder, I'll notice that there's a bunch of different folders. And again, there's this dbt project.yaml. This is essentially what sets up all the details of your project. Okay, so basically saying, okay, here's the name of your project, this is the version of your project, all that kind of fun stuff, like what kind of version of config files are you using. This is the profile. So this references that profiles.yaml. So essentially, if you wanted to switch what profile you're referring to a different one, that would be what you would change. Here you're saying, hey, which folder are you referring for different aspects of what you're doing with DBT? So what would you write? Your seeds, tests, analyses, snapshots. For the most part, we're mainly just going to be using this models folder for this tutorial series. Okay, clean targets. These are going to be folders that when you run the command dbt clean, get cleaned out. Okay, so generally stuff where you're going to have like very temporary items. Okay, now here's where you would configure your models. So essentially you say, hey, here's your models. In the models folder, there should be, this is the project, okay? And in that project, there should be a folder in the models folder called examples. So in this case, hey, if I open the models folder, there's a folder called examples. And then here, this is explaining like how those models should be handled. So in this case, they should be turned into views. Okay, so if I were to create another folder, so say here we'll say, hey, we'll have a folder called, you know, semantic layer. And actually, I'll make it one word, semantic layer. And then same thing, we're just going to materialize as views. Generally, you prefer the materialize as views as in Dremio, because the idea is you want to try to make as little few copies as possible. Okay, so now what I would do is that here in my models folder, I can create a new folder called semantic layer. And I can write models in there. Okay, and again, essentially models are going to be these SQL files and these schema.yaml files, which we'll talk about in later videos. But essentially, that is how you set up your DBT environment. In the next video, we'll run our first DBT models. So I'll see you there.